Hello, I'm Justine Willis. Welcome to the New Dimensions Cafe. Today I'm hosting Dr. Glenn Aparicio Parry, an educator and ecopsychologist who is deeply engaged in reimagining Western thought by integrating Indigenous wisdom, ecological worldview, and principles of wholeness. He's the author of Original Love, the Timeless Source of Wholeness. I'm speaking with Glenn at his home by remote connection. Welcome, Glenn, to the New Dimensions Cafe.
Good to be here.
It's
Always
great to
happy to
have
share
you.
time with you.
Oh, great. Thank
I
you
also
so
have my
much.
dog Momo here. If you
Yes,
see a tail
as
waving in the
I
background, that's
love, I
Momo.
love seeing him. Oh, great. You speak of original love, which is the ever presence of wholeness. That's a very different kind of definition of love from romantic love, so to speak. And I know in these times we're in tremendous breakdown. And you talk about breakdown as a breakthrough.
Yeah, no, that's as you were speaking, the exact phrase you then articulated came to mind, which is a breakdown to create a breakthrough. I mean, I tend to trace the turning point to the bombings that happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because love is about wholeness, and the atom being separated in that violent way seemed to be the opposite of wholeness. It also seemed to be the absolute bottom for humanity in terms of runaway scientific invention not being grounded through wisdom. And of course, some of those scientists realized this right away, and there's no doubt about that. But it was and still remains. I mean, I was born in 1955, so in my entire life, I've lived in the nuclear age. So this was in Jean Gebser, the Swiss philosopher's terms about that this would be the representing the deficient mental rational consciousness, where, because mental rational consciousness has a beautiful side, and when rationality first arose, it was all about beauty. So, for the ancient Greeks, it was about divine proportionality. And so the very word rational comes from ratio, which means about a proportion between things. So it doesn't have to be bad, but we've come into an era where rational mind is no longer associated with beauty and wisdom. And it needs to be reconnected with that. And that's really where indigenous and feminine wisdom enter. And that's what we need to welcome in, usher in, so that we can be balanced and we can operate in wise ways.
I think it was Descartes and Newton that really began to separate mind from body. So the rational thought became more pronounced. I'm thinking about the natural world, and I'm thinking about physics and the idea of entanglement. I mean, that we are all interconnected. And what you talk about in original love is that we are all embedded in this source of wholeness.
Thank you. I think I address that in all the books that I've written: Original Thinking, Original Politics, and Original Love. The fact that the human used to be understood as a nexus of wholeness, that what made us human was what connected us to everything else. And then we went into an era, or when we began to imagine that we were separate and transcendent from the natural world. And that really began to happen not that long ago. People think it happened in great antiquity, But, it's really the last 2,000 something years that we've begun on this path, and particularly in the last 600 years, where we strongly embarked on the path of looking for how humans can change or conquer nature. And my dear ancestor Dan Moonhawk Alford used to talk about the ancient Greeks that talked about, just like the Maori do today, they thought of the future as ahead of them, where it had already manifested. And the past was behind them, where they didn't have eyes to see. That's why the ancient Greeks went to oracles to see the future. They thought it was hubris to try to predict the future. But when that shifts, and that happened in the Renaissance with the advent of linear perspective, then we began to imagine that the future was ahead of us. Hence, we wanted to predict it and control it. And that's actually embedded into what modern science is. And I'm not saying that's all bad, because there's something gained and something lost in living every day, as Joni Mitchell said. But, it's what is lost is the immersive quality, the beautiful sense that we used to have of being immersed in nature. Even linear perspective is this idea of like a view from one stationary eye. We actually have two very moving liquid eyes. We're already immersed in the world. I think that's more accurate, to be honest.
Speaking about eyes, I think that you mentioned something about the two-eyed view of life.
Oh, two-eyed seeing. There's a teacher, a native teacher, who spoke about a two-eyed way of seeing, which allowed for two worldviews to exist side by side. And when I was running the Seed Institute way back in 2005, we had a conference called Oil and Water, Can They Mix? Western and Indigenous Approaches to Economy, Ecology, and Community. And what came out of that conference, which was such a beautiful idea, is that, oil and water, or indigenous and Western views, can coexist a little bit like a sacred emulsion. So what we really need to do is to allow for the integrity of the difference to exist side by side. Don't try to force a solution. Don't try to synthesize everything into this grand worldview. Just listen deeply to indigenous people, listen deeply to the wise people in Western culture, and let them sit side by side and make a sacred emulsion. We came out of it saying, we're making sacred mayonnaise.
That's a good example of it. Recently, in my congregation at Ner Shalom, we participated in Yom Kippur, and we did practices of being with trees, sitting with trees and sitting in nature and understanding our own rootedness and our own branches reaching out to community. So I'm hearing, if it's indigenous wisdom or Western wisdom or whatever you want to call it, it's not an either or situation. It's an integration.
Oh, very much so. And I'm 50% Jewish, by the way. My
Oh, wonderful.
my mother is Jewish. My father is both Aragon Spanish and Basque. My grandmother on my father's side was Basque from the High Pyrenees of Spain. The only reason why I usually introduce myself as Basque, Aragon Spanish, and Jewish is that my father's side of the family was so much closer. And my grandmother actually lived with us between the time I was 3 years old till 13. And that made a huge difference in my life. I think that is why I ended up being drawn to the Navajo in New Mexico. They're both sheep herders. I visited my grandmother's village in the High Pyrenees of Spain in 1969. And at that time, we were the first automobile that ever came into that village. It was just, they lived off the land. And so that was a great teaching for me. It was very great. And to go back to Yom Kippur, we often call it the Day of Atonement, right? But atonement, does I believe the etymology is at one-ment, right? Is it not? So it's funny how the word shifts totally to say atone. It sounds like you did something wrong, so you got to atone for your sins. But at one-ment is a very different feeling for me.
And that just takes me to the origin of the word origin.
Well, when I wrote the book, Original Thinking, actually the first book that I wrote, I looked at both the origin of original and thinking, and it was very fascinating. It was very fascinating. Well, original. My experience with that comes from the dialogue circle that we convened from 1999 to 2011, and Leroy Little Bear asking the question, is it possible to come up with an original thought? And it's then, only then, because the native people in the room tried to connect to origin as a place, but the Western people tried to think of something brand new that had never been said before or done before. And so that's when I realized that Western culture has replaced place with time. And so originally meant place. If you want to laugh about it, there was a Seinfeld episode once when Jerry Seinfeld, somebody's going out to get pizza from Original Ray's Pizza, and he asks, is that the original Ray's Pizza?
I love it.
So we still use original in terms of place still. So he meant the original one on whatever street that is. But we also tend to use it mostly to express novelty.
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
This is wrapped up in gratitude because the word thinking originally came from thanking, and that was true in English, French, Dutch, Norse, Frisian, German, and Old Anglo-Saxon. Those are the only ones I found, 7 of them, but it could be a whole lot more. And so I think that when you go to place, you connect with the rhythms of a place and you become grateful for your life, which has emerged from this place. And that's so beautiful.
I know that you mentioned briefly deep listening.
Yeah. Deep listening is something that I continue to learn more and more about. I've had some very good teachers. I once observed Leroy Little Bear was the moderator of the dialogues that were held for 13 years that featured Western scientists and natives. I would say scientists because the word science just means to know, but sometimes we say native elders. I once asked Leroy, I observed that he would never call on anybody that didn't further the dialogue. So I asked him, Leroy, I've been observing how you, because sometimes people would raise their hand, he wouldn't call on them right then. And he would call on people who had something that were going to contribute that was going to further the dialogue. So I said, how do you do that, Leroy? And his answer was one word: listen. One word. See, I saw that he was psychic. He knew what people were going to say before they said it. He knew what was in their head. And he was doing that just through listening. And I think that if we do listen very deeply, then we begin to hear perhaps a little more from the ancestors, a little more from the plants, a little more from the trees, a little more from the breeze. And we begin to sense and feel. And some people in that dialogue circle, like Joseph Rael or Beautiful Painted Arrow, he used to see the swirling energy in the room. So I never saw it, but I could feel it. I could feel the energy was moving through the room. And that's a beautiful thing. How we're going to find love, too. I mean, that's because love is ultimately a vibration. It's not a sound that we register with our ears.
It's listening with our whole being.
That's true. And in dialogue circles, we talk about listening for the purpose of understanding rather than to ready your reply. And that doesn't happen that much in life. I think it's happening with you and I now, to at least to a large degree, where we're listening with our whole being. But it's hard in regular conversation. You'll notice how often people interrupt each other, and they really, half of their thinking, as I think Gibran said, it was murdered. He said half your thinking, and because you're thinking of what you're going to say and reply, and instead of actually listening for the purpose of understanding, which slows things down.
So, do you have hope for our deep listening in the future?
I do. It's so funny that you say that. I once asked my former agent, he would still be my agent, but he's now in the spirit world, Bill Gladstone. I've also been blessed with his wife, Gail, is now my agent. But Bill, I was asking him about how important audiobooks were. And he said, I'll tell you something about audiobooks. They're not only the fastest growing segment of the book industry, they're the only growing segment of the book industry. So people are listening more and more. They're also listening to podcasts. They're listening more and more, and they're reading less and less.
Glenn, that's a more direct transmission in some ways, in my thinking, that if you're reading something, you're interpreting these symbols on a page. Whereas when you're hearing something, there's not that intermediary interpretation going on.
Perhaps. I think that audiobooks are definitely here to stay, and podcasts. There are more and more and more of them. So that's what we're doing now, right? A podcast. So I mean, it's radio or listening, or even in the old days when we just before video phones or any kind, listening on a telephone was special too, because you do tune into a certain vibration, a certain frequency. I think there's something very positive about reading books too, so I don't want to dismiss that. But there are different modalities, and some people are more attuned one way or the other. And it seems like the whole society is going to greater listening. Hopefully, this does portend some shift in vibration.
Well, for me, I just have to confess, I do both. When I get an audible book, and I love listening, especially when I'm driving, I just love listening. And I oftentimes also buy the book too, because there's something in the listening I want to refer to back again, and I want to see the spelling, or I want to see I refer to both.
Well, I think that's good. That's good. And I recorded my own audiobooks for Original Politics and Original Love. But I haven't done an audiobook for Original Thinking because it came out in 2015, and that's like a different era or something. It hadn't taken off yet, but I need to go back and record that.
Please do. I think many people would be very interested in going to the original of the trilogy, Original Thinking, Original Politics, Original Love, and get all three. Thank you so much. Glenn, I want to thank you for being a guest on New Dimensions Cafe. Thank you so much. I've been speaking with Dr. Glenn Aparicio Parry, an educator and ecopsychologist who has been talking and engaged in reimagining Western thought by integrating Indigenous wisdom, ecological worldview, and principles of wholeness. And he's the author of Original Love, the Timeless Source of Wholeness. And if you want to know more about his work, go to his website, originalthinking.us. Or you can get there through the New Dimensions website, newdimensions.org, where you'll find over 2,000 programs in our archive. I'm Justine Willis-Toms. I want to thank you for joining us at the New Dimensions Cafe, and I invite you, please do join us again.